Hello, welcome to Lost in Movies with Alec Kerr. I'm the film critic for the Conway Daily Sun, and this week I'm joined by one of my colleagues.
I'm Erik Eisele. I work for the Conway Daily Sun with Alec.
And this week we're doing a special episode. That's why Erik is here. We're going to be talking about journalists in movies, primarily print journalists, because that's what we are. And so I wanted to actually start off with a passage from Toby Young's How to Lose Friends and Alienate People, which was turned into a movie starring Simon Pegg. And what Toby Young did was he was a British journalist who was courted by Vanity Fair and brought to the United States, and in a matter of 3 years completely tarnished his career and burnt all his bridges in New York. But in his memoir, he talks about the reason he wanted to become a journalist was because of old films from the 1930s that made newspapermen into these heroic figures, these pillars of society, and just wanted to read a little thing he said about that. And let's see. It seemed genuine independence of mind and freedom of action did exist in America after all. These qualities could be found among New York newspapermen. If these films were anything to go by, they were a race of supermen. Indeed, they seemed to qualify for membership in the natural aristocracy that Thomas Jefferson identified as America's best hope in the famous letter to John Adams in 1813. I soon discovered why reporters were portrayed so sympathetically in these films. They were either written by journalists or based on material, plays, novels, short stories, produced by journalists. Indeed, it's not an exaggeration to say that the screwball comedy as a genre was invented by the crowd of newspapermen and magazine writers who went west in the 1920s. According to the film critic Pauline Kael, this group, which comprised some of the most talented alcoholics the country has ever produced, was lured to Los Angeles by the promise of huge salaries and immediately set upon importing their irreverent, wisecracking style into the movies. Out went stodgy melodramas set in mythical Central European principalities, and in came madcap, antic comedies set in New York newsroom offices.
Well, that's, you know, two of the movies we watched, Front Page and Front Page.
Yeah.
When was the first one? When was the second one?
The first one was 31, and the second one was 74, 75.
I watched the second one, Walter Matthau and Jack Lemmon, right? And that's the news reporters were the smartest, quickest. You know, they're better than the cops. They were better than the mayor, better than everybody else. Like they're the film noir guys.
Yeah.
They're faster, better, smarter.
Yeah, and it's because, you know, Ben Hatchett, who wrote the Front Page, he was that guy, and so he portrayed himself that way.
It was, and you know, I just couldn't. I watched the first one, the 1931, when the guy wanted, when the newspaper guy kind of went into action, he, you know, just was one bang, 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 talking a mile a minute, like he was. Just really, it made him look like the smartest guy in the room.
Right. And the way they banter and the way the Front Page is set up is that it's the press room, and you have all the newspapers there, and this is kind of no longer really exists anymore. Right. But they all have to call into their newspapers, and they have the whole wall of phones, and each phone is a direct line back to their newspaper. And they're all like, they're playing poker, waiting for the news to happen, and they're all bantering, they're all nitpicking each other.
Well, and they're ruthless. One thing I noticed, and this was through several of the movies, particularly the comedy or ones that had a comedic element, was there's always the stodgy one, the New York Times. Yeah. Like, there's always the one who thinks so much of himself and gets kind of ostracized to the corner. But what I was surprised by in the Front Page, when the hooker comes in, the way that she is treated, they were no less ruthless to a lady, even though she was a prostitute. You know, it still was. They were going fast and loose with how they treated her.
Right. And even when the fiance of the main character, Hildy Johnson, they pull no punches with her either, and she's supposed to be somewhat of a high-class woman.
I was surprised that was Susan Sarandon.
I know.
I was looking. I was
super
watching
young Susan Sarandon. It was like the same year she did Rocky Horror Picture Show, and she sang in this movie too. So it was kind of interesting to.
Yeah. I thought I thought it was really interesting. Just, you know, it was even the newspaper guys who were not the main character, they were still, when the sheriff made when the sheriff was like, I know my gun when I see it.
They're like, wait a second.
They were still 2 steps ahead. The newspaper guys, even the dumb newspaper guys, were 2 steps ahead of the cops all the time.
Right. So, and the way front page is set up is that you have Hildy Johnson, played by Jack Lemmon in the 70s version, is going to give it all up, get married, and then his reporter, his editor, Walter Burns, is desperately trying to convince him to stay, and setting up all these little traps, like putting the really, really green reporter on the story. And when the guy's like, oh, no, he's just botching the story. He's like, get out of the way.
Yeah, I love the closing scene, and it's not to ruin it for anybody, but he finally lets him go, and he gives him his watch as a gift. Like, here's a token of my appreciation. And then
he's walking away, and you know he's got something up his sleeve.
he goes to the train ticket booth and says, "Call the next stop," and report. You know, have them grab Hildy Johnson. That bastard stole my watch.
Yeah, and it's a great ending. It really is.
It totally was. The first one, I thought it was interesting too. I would have thought over 40 years there'd be a little bit of a change in characterization of the woman and Hildy Johnson. You know, it really was the same movie from 1931.
Yeah, and it works. I think the only thing that they were allowed to do is because in the 30s there was a lot more restrictions on what you could and couldn't say, so they were able to swear now, and they were able to be a little bit more loose with some of their language.
They put a lot of kind of blatant characterizations, the dumb sheriff, and that sort of thing. But the thing that I thought was interesting, the floozy hooker, the corrupt politician, but the serial killer, or the murderer, did not fit the murderer profile.
And I think that was it. Like, especially in the 70s version, he's just this sweet guy. You gotta just want to give him a hug.
Yeah.
He's like a murderer by accident, and that's exactly what he is. And he's also a pinko, evil pinko.
And the newspaper was. It was really interesting how the newspaper guy Burns, the owner, was like. Or the newspaper men were like, pinko commie, whatever. He's not. He was from this house. He was from North Dakota. Who cares?
Yeah.
And then as soon as they were. They had helped out in arresting him. They were like, the Examiner saves.
Right.
saves.
And it's interesting to see when everybody's calling into the newspapers. Some people, one paper tells it straight.
Right.
The other person's like, he came out shooting, and it's just like, wait.
Well, I thought that was funny about it. These are newspaper guy writers.
Right.
And
for their different writers, they have different slants.
And some of them, but I mean, the guys who originally wrote the movie. They make the newspaper guy they make Hildy Johnson look like a hero.
Right.
But they also play on the line of, sensationalism.
Right.
The problem, like, do the newspapers blow this stuff out of proportion? Do we, we don't really care what happens. If it goes down in a hail of bullets, it's going to make for a great front page,
Right. The whole "if it leads" thing.
Yeah.
And there was also a third version of the front page that came out between those two called His Girl Friday, where there was a gender reversal, and Hildy Johnson became a woman. And the editor was also a former husband. And so it adds a whole sexual tension to it. And it was Cary Grant was Walter Burns, and it was Rosalind Russell was Hildy Johnson. And so the dialogue doesn't really change, but just because of that
how they treat each other,
it just becomes really this screwball comedy because now it's a woman being pulled between two different guys.
The thing that I thought was interesting, we were talking about this a little earlier, you were saying that the 1931 version, that really characterized the newspaper man, right?
Right. Yeah, I mean, the image of the newspaper man that we think of, the fedora and the press card.
I love that when the green guy, you see him stick his press card in his hat, and you know, all of a sudden, okay, now I'm a newspaper man.
And yeah, I think that is kind of like the image. Like, I think you could probably tie the image of the journalist back to 1931. If you and I think, and we were talking about this, I think all other films have been nostalgically going back to this image. You know, these journalists were played by the likes of like James Stewart and Cary Grant and, you know, Clark Gable, like the most dashing men of their time period.
Which, if you come into the Conway Daily Sun office, you won't see Clark Gable there.
No, you won't. You will not see, you know, you might be able to see a Jimmy Stewart, maybe, on a good day.
But, you know, and the other thing that I thought was really interesting in watching both of those is watching the press runs and watching the, you know, just the lead type going in just from the introduction and that sort of thing. It just has a real, because the 1970s one, it's set in 1931 still, and it's got a real nostalgic feel, and I think that that's something that a lot of the newspaper stories have, is back when they were doing, you know, when reporting was honest and when they were really making changes, positive changes for us, you know.
And something I found interesting in both the 30s version and the 70s version was that it was bereft of score. There was no music.
Right. Except for when they sang.
Except when they sang, right. And it's almost like the dialogue was all the music they really needed, because there was just...
Because it's so quick.
It's so quick. And put that in stark contrast with 1994, The Paper. You've got this big, booming Randy Newman score that's always there. It's this jaunty little thing. It's in stark contrast with the content of that film, which is very, you know, at least for the first hour, is very edgy, very biting, hard-hitting stuff. And then you got this...
There were a couple times, and now that you pointed out, because we noticed that, I watched it with my wife, and we were both like, you know, what's going on with this music as that went, and that's totally.
And I think it's kind of it's like, you know, just let the dialogue speak for itself, you know. And then of course over the credits you've got that generic, patented, you know, Randy Newman song where you can literally just insert any lyrics for any of his songs and it's all the same.
Well, you know, it's funny when you say you've seen Brick, right?
Yes.
And the speed, that's where I was thinking about the film noir part of it. When in the 1931 version, when there are fire trucks screaming down the streets, and Hildy Johnson has to grab his hat and coat, and his wife's in the back, and he's just. It's on Netflix, and it's a lower quality recording, and he was talking so fast, I was like, I can't even tell what he's saying.
And it didn't help that the audio is a little warbled.
But it just reminded me of Brick and the speed, like this real film noir.
His Girl Friday is even faster.
Oh, really? Yeah.
His Girl Friday shaves the movie down to like 95 minutes, and it's the same dialogue, but it's even faster.
That's really neat.
And
that's where you just get this, you know, these guys are fast talking, smart, you know, they're thinking on their feet, and you see that with Jack Lemmon, as he's like, you know, how do I get rid of everybody else because I'm trying to hide the prisoner in the desk.
And The Paper, I do think, is kind of in that tradition. I do think the movie is too long. Like, the last hour of it is not very good, with Michael Keaton's wife going into labor. Jason Alexander has a bit that could have been completely removed from the movie.
I totally, yes, there was the whole, you know, the fight in the press room between Michael Keaton and Meryl Streep.
Glenn Close.
Sorry, Glenn Close.
Yeah.
My fault. Yeah. And I really thought, there it is. Like, that's it. And then his wife has the, you know, the medical problem and everything. I totally agree.
Yeah. But the first hour of it, where Michael Keaton is going after this story, and then he gets Randy Quaid to do things, and then his pregnant wife is getting information for him, and she's on leave because she's pregnant, but she just can't resist going after a story.